The Star Wars saga ultimately rotates around a single collapse that pulls everything else into its wake, and that collapse belongs to Anakin Skywalker. His life is not merely one story, among many, but the gravitational center that bends every other trajectory toward itself. Characters do not simply interact with him, they are shaped by proximity to his rise and fall. Institutions respond to him, allies define themselves by saving or stopping him, and enemies design entire strategies around controlling him. The galaxy does not change around Anakin, he changes the galaxy by breaking inside it. Anakin Skywalker functions less like a protagonist and more like a force of nature within the narrative structure. His potential destabilizes the Jedi, his fear empowers the Sith, and his legacy determines the shape of future resistance. Even characters who never meet him are reacting to the consequences of his choices. The saga treats his fall as a historical event rather than a personal failure. Everything that follows becomes fallout. The Jedi Order's collapse cannot be understood, apart from how it mishandles Anakin, because he is the stress test that exposes every flaw they refuse to confront. They sense his power but respond with caution, instead of care, and surveillance instead of trust. Their rules are applied rigidly at the moment flexibility is most required. Each master believes restraint is wisdom, yet none recognize how restraint without empathy becomes abandonment. Through Anakin, the Order reveals its inability to adapt. Jedi Order defines itself as a stabilizing force, but Anakin reveals how brittle that stability truly is. Obi-Wan teaches obedience over understanding. Yoda offers warnings without guidance, and Windu treats Anakin as a liability to be managed rather than a person to be mentored. The Council senses danger, yet responds with distance, creating the very isolation they fear. When Anakin falls, the Jedi do not lose a member. They lose the illusion that their system works. Obi-Wan Kenobi's tragedy is inseparable from Anakin's because his identity becomes defined by failure rather than intention. He loves Anakin as a brother, but loves the Order as a structure, and those loyalties come into conflict. Each time he defers to doctrine, he reinforces Anakin's sense of being unseen. By the end, Obi-Wan is not defeated by the Sith, but by regret. His exile is not punishment, but consequence. Yoda and Windu represent the institutional ceiling Anakin cannot break through. Their authority is absolute, yet their insight is limited by tradition. They interpret fear as weakness rather than information, and attachment as corruption rather than motivation. In doing so, they misread Anakin's struggle entirely. The Order does not fall because Anakin disobeys it, falls because it never learns how to reach him. The birth of the Empire is likewise personal, rather than abstract, because it is constructed directly from Anakin's fear of loss. Palpatine does not simply exploit political instability, he exploits emotional vulnerability. The promise of control over death becomes the lever that moves history. What begins as a desire to save one life metastasizes into a regime built on domination. Love does not disappear, it is weaponized. Palpatine understands that fear is most powerful when it masquerades as protection. He never asks Anakin to desire power only to avoid pain. Each step confirms Anakin's belief that strength equals safety, and that hesitation equals loss. The Empire is not imposed on Anakin, it is co-created through his desperation. Authoritarianism is born not from hatred, but from terror of vulnerability. This is what makes the Empire feel intimate rather than distant, because its foundation is emotional logic rather than ideology. Stormtroopers and Star Destroyers are expressions of a single choice, multiplied outward. Control replaces trust because trust failed Anakin when he needed it most. The regime inherits his worldview that only absolute authority can prevent suffering. The galaxy pays the price for one man's unresolved grief. Padmé Amidala occupies a quieter but equally critical position in this gravitational field because her faith shapes what survives after Anakin's fall. She believes in democracy, even as it erodes, and in compassion, even as it is dismissed as weakness. Her refusal to abandon these ideals becomes her legacy. Though she dies before seeing the consequences, her values are carried forward through her children. Hope is inherited, not taught. Padmé Amidala represents the road not taken both politically and personally. She believes institutions can be redeemed through participation rather than control. She believes Anakin can be saved through trust rather than fear. Her tragedy is not that she is wrong, but that she is alone. When she is silenced, the galaxy loses its last advocate for balance without domination. Luke and Leia are shaped by Padmé's convictions, even without knowing her, because values persist beyond presence. Luke inherits her belief that people are not defined by their worst acts. Leia inherits her conviction that systems must be challenged from within and without. Both carry forward compassion as resistance. Padmé's influence proves that legacy is not measured only in power, but in principle. Even the saga's villains orbit the Skywalkers, rather than standing apart from them, because their relevance depends on that bloodline. Palpatine invests everything in controlling Anakin, and later his descendants because the Skywalkers represent uncontrollable potential. Tarkin builds systems to suppress individual agency precisely because Anakin proved how dangerous individuality can be to rigid order. Power fears unpredictability, and the Skywalkers embody it. The antagonists are not independent forces, but parasites feeding on unresolved conflict. Their strategies are reactions, not origins. Without the Skywalker family, their schemes lose narrative gravity. This reinforces the idea that the saga is not about good versus evil in abstraction, but about how one family's trauma reshapes galactic history. The villains endure only as long as that trauma remains unhealed. What emerges is a story where cause and effect ripple outward, across generations without ever dissipating. Anakin's fall does not end with him. It embeds itself into systems, beliefs, and mentorships. Each attempt to control the damage inadvertently preserves it. Silence, secrecy, and fear become inherited behaviours. The galaxy becomes a mirror, reflecting one family's unresolved pain. The prequels do not simply explain the originals, they infect them with consequence. Every choice made later exists in dialogue with Anakin's fall, whether acknowledged or denied. The saga insists that history is personal before it is political, and that realization opens the door to how legacy and trauma continue to shape everything that comes after. What follows Anakin's fall is not a clean reset, but an inheritance shaped by absent secrecy and unresolved guilt, and this is where the saga's emotional continuity becomes most visible. Luke Skywalker does not begin his journey as a prodigy, destined to surpass his father, but as a correction to a catastrophe he barely understands. His power is secondary to his disposition, and his greatest strength is not talent, but refusal. He is shaped less by what Anakin was, and more by what Anakin failed to become. The narrative frames Luke as a response rather than a replacement. Luke Skywalker inherits hope rather than dominance, and that distinction defines every major choice he makes. He is repeatedly offered the same shortcuts that trapped his father, yet he consistently resists framing power as solution. Where Anakin sought control, Luke seeks connection. His arc is not about becoming stronger, but about staying open when strength would be easier. In refusing to kill Vader, Luke breaks the logic that built the Empire. This refusal is often mistaken for sentimentality, but within the saga, it is radical. Luke's mercy is informed by the long shadow of Anakin's fall, even if he only understands fragments of it. He senses that violence framed as necessity is the first step toward inevitability. By choosing compassion, Luke interrupts a cycle that institutions fail to stop. He succeeds where the Jedi failed precisely because he does not act like them. Leia Organa carries a different inheritance, one rooted in responsibility rather than redemption. She never has the luxury of spiritual exploration because the galaxy is already burning. Her path mirrors Padmé's in that she believes systems must be confronted rather than abandoned. Leia's strength lies in endurance and clarity under pressure. She does not seek legacy yet becomes one through action. Leia Organa embodies the burden of leadership without mysticism. She inherits Padmé's political conviction and Anakin's defiance stripped of idealism. Leia understands cost intuitively and accepts it without romance. Her resistance is pragmatic, sustained, and deeply personal. She represents the idea that heroism often looks like administration sacrifice and compromise rather than spectacle. Together, Luke and Leia represent divergent answers to the same trauma. One confronts it internally, the other externally. Neither path is framed as complete on its own, and the saga benefits from that tension. Redemption without resistance risks complacency. Resistance without compassion risks perpetuating harm. Their sibling bond becomes a balancing force that Anakin never had. This balance begins to fracture in the next generation, where secrecy replaces dialogue and fear replaces trust. Ben Solo does not inherit Anakin's raw circumstance, but he inherits the silence surrounding it. He grows up in the shadow of legends without access to their failures. The truth is withheld in the hope of protection, but absence breeds distortion. Trauma unspoken becomes myth, and myth becomes obsession. Ben Solo is not a repetition of Anakin, but a consequence of incomplete healing. Where Anakin feared loss, Ben fears inadequacy. He is crushed by expectation rather than control. The darkness that calls to him offers identity more than power. His fall is quieter, more fragmented, and deeply rooted in isolation. The tragedy of Ben Solo is that redemption was never fully modelled for him. Luke's failure is not in sensing darkness, but in reacting to it with fear. The moment Luke considers violence even briefly, it echoes the Jedi Council's response to Anakin. History does not repeat perfectly, but it rhymes through instinct. Fear of failure becomes the catalyst for failure itself. This pattern reveals how mentorship within the saga is consistently undermined by unresolved trauma. Obi-Wan teaches Luke while haunted by Anakin. Luke teaches Ben while haunted by Vader. Each mentor believes awareness of past mistakes will prevent repetition, yet they never fully process their own fear. Instruction becomes caution, caution becomes distance, and distance becomes abandonment. The cycle tightens not through malice, but through avoidance. The saga uses this repetition to argue that legacy is not wisdom by default. Knowledge passed down without emotional integration becomes brittle. Each generation inherits lessons without context and rules without empathy. The Force amplifies this problem by rewarding intensity while punishing restraint. Without balance, mentorship becomes projection. The student becomes a mirror rather than an individual. Ben Solo's turn therefore represents not the failure of one person, but the failure of accumulated silence. Secrets meant to protect become weapons in the hands of manipulation. Snoke and later Palpatine exploit gaps in understanding rather than raw desire. They offer Ben a narrative that explains his pain. Control enters not through force, but through validation. This is why the sequel era feels less like a new conflict and more like an aftershock. The wars change names, but the underlying struggle remains unresolved. Each regime falls without fully addressing the conditions that birthed it. Victory is declared, but reckoning is deferred. The Skywalker family continues to absorb the cost of that deferral. Across all three trilogies, the saga insists that history is intimate before it is epic. Galactic shifts originate in personal moments of fear, trust, and failure. The Skywalkers are not important because they are powerful, but because they are exposed. Their choices are magnified, not isolated. Through them, the narrative explores how unhealed wounds metastasize across systems. The final shape of Star Wars is therefore not a straight line of progress, but a spiral. Characters move forward while circling unresolved themes. Hope resurfaces but must be defended repeatedly. Each generation is offered the chance to break the pattern, but must recognize it first. Healing requires confrontation, not erasure. Silence is never neutral. Every rebellion, every empire, and every fragile peace traces back to choices made in love and fear. The Skywalkers do not cause all suffering, but they reveal how suffering spreads. Their story is not about destiny fulfilled, but about damage acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, the saga finds its meaning.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.